immediate left is our program's Yoga Rockstar, been featured on the LSU website. Stuart Sarbacker, who's also puts on another hat and coaches youth soccer on Tuesday afternoons. He works in the comparative study of religion, particularly in Indian religions, or the religions of the Indian subcontinent, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism. Before coming here, he taught at Northwestern University, and he received awards for his teaching of undergraduate students. He's published one book, Samadhi, that deals with contemplative spirituality in Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism, and is working on two other projects right now that perhaps he'll explain a little bit more. I'm not sure, but it's on the 8 limbs of yoga, a handbook, as well as another one, Tracing the Path of Yoga, which also focuses on the 8-limb yoga system. And he's also registered as a yoga teacher with the Yoga Alliance. So these are serious people with their commitments to their life passions and their athletic passions.
So yeah, this is Ayana Brown, who finished 3rd in the National Yoga Asana Championship. This is from the New York Times here. So very interesting to hear these other talks, and I can see points of intersection and also points where perhaps we're going to disagree a bit in terms of our approach here. But what I want to do today is really talk a little bit about issues of embodiment and their spiritual and religious implications within the context of modern yoga traditions. I talk specifically about modern yoga because yoga as it exists today is really the product of a particular historical moment. It really emerges out of a sort of cosmopolitan zeitgeist or spirit of the times, especially in India in the late 19th and early 20th century. Much of what we see today and think of as yoga really is a product of that period in time, was sort of welded together. I don't think this necessarily means that modern yoga is less authentic than any previous form of yoga. In fact, during every phase of its development over time, it's adapted and been changed in profound ways. But I think it's really important to take a step back and really look at this not as something timeless and unchanging, but as really something that has a history. You know, our conceptions of the body, our conceptions of the spirituality have a history. Let's examine them. I'm particularly interested, though, in how modern yoga has given way to this notion of yoga as a sport. And I want to kind of point out how that, on one hand, seems like a movement away in certain ways from the traditional practices of yoga in India, but in other ways, it still reflects in very important ways a continuity within the tradition. So many people identify yoga and its emergence in the Indian context with Swami Vivekananda, an Indian sadhu or ascetic who came to the United States and spoke at the Parliament of the World's Religions in 1893. Vivekananda made a huge splash at this event, and soon he had many American disciples and devotees, and he actually toured the country in part trying to collect money to bring back to spend on various charities in India. Vivekananda framed yoga as India's spiritual gift to the material West. You know, the basic narrative of what's sometimes referred now as Orientalism, the idea that you have this spiritual exotic East and you have this material scientific West. And Vivekananda negotiated that conversation quite skillfully. But the yoga he presented was really a contemplative yoga, a meditative yoga. And though he was a huge figure in the championing of yoga on a broader scale, it was really a series of other teachers that brought yoga with its postural emphasis to a great, much larger international audience. I'm just going to look at one figure within that movement and a few of his key disciples to get us to the point where we're talking about how especially the bodily virtuosity in modern yoga has both this connection to sport on one hand, but also embodies certain principles that are continuous in the Indian yoga tradition and have more of a religious or spiritual flavor. So Tirumalai Krishnamacharya is sometimes referred to as the father of modern yoga, who in the 1930s and 40s taught in the Mysore Palace in southern India under the patronage of the Maharaja of Mysore, Krishnaraja Wodeyar. Krishnaraja Wodeyar had diabetes, and the story is that Krishnamacharya helped heal his diabetes, and he's given a job teaching in the Mysore Palace. Krishnamacharya's disciples went on to tell a much larger narrative of Krishnamacharya searching out a true yoga guru, ending up in the Himalaya mountains, crossing over in Tibet, and finding a guru at a lake called Mansarovar at the foot of Mount Kailash, one of the most sacred mountains for both Hindus and Buddhists in South Asia. Well, Krishnamacharya, without doubt, was a virtuoso of various postural techniques. Here, internal muscular control of the abdomen here.
And his ankles are going the wrong
way. He's sitting in Mula Bandhasana here, the root lock posture, which would be a medieval Hatha yoga posture, yoga of force, the yoga of forceful action, let's say. Well, Krishnamacharya was the tutor principally to young boys in the palace, but also some girls, including his own daughters. And yes, that is Krishnamacharya on the right, standing on one of his students. According to stories, at least purportedly told by B.K.S. Iyengar, he was quite forceful, especially in the early years. Iyengar told the story of him slapping one kid so hard you could see the outline of the fingers on the kid's face, which might be an opening for another conversation about coaches and coaching. But I want to stay on track here. I mean, there are lots of places where we could digress. Well, on one level, we have someone who is at least claiming to be embodying an authentic ancient yoga tradition. On the other hand, he taught in a palace that was quite cosmopolitan in nature. And at the bottom here, you see a book here from Norman Schulman's Yoga Tradition of the Mysore Palace, an exercise equipment that he had imported from England, which was all the rage at this time. So Krishnamacharya would have been aware of these sorts of practices of using ropes and using these various pulleys and things like that, which later on becomes an important part of the Iyengar yoga repertoire. Without doubt, he was influenced by reading texts in the Mysore Palace of various yoga postures, but also manuals in which there had been an attempt to synthesize European gymnastics techniques. And in fact, European gymnastics were themselves taught within the Mysore Palace. Many scholars, most recently Mark Singleton, have noticed that the European gymnastic systems at the time, here in particular book gymnastics, which has a very interesting and kind of scary political association with fascism in Europe, in fact. If you look at these, anyone who's practiced some yoga will recognize these postures look quite familiar. And so these were all in the zeitgeist of the time. The YMCA was in India. There was an influx of European conceptions of physical culture and also these bodily practices. Another Indian Maharaja, in fact, Bhavanrao Pant, had systematized what's come to be known as the so-called sun salutation, a series of movements that's probably originally based on a set of prostrations given to the sun, Surya Namaskara, meaning salutation to the sun. But really, he conceived of it as a sort of nationalist exercise and would have hundreds all together at once performing the sun salutation in synchronicity. Strengthening the individual becomes the strengthening of the nation, and everyone moves together in sync. In fact, in the 20s and 30s, the sun salutation is typically viewed, if anything, as a warm-up exercise for the practice of yoga, and isn't really necessarily integrated into the practice of yoga itself. However, that's part of what exactly Krishnamacharya did. He integrated this moving sequence of movements into the performance of yoga postures.
So this is who we can blame for downward dog? Like, so if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have to do downward dog in my yoga classes?
Maybe not. Maybe not, yeah.
Eat it.
And so, but he was also in an environment where there was Indian wrestling, including a special form of pole climbing here, which is called Malakam. And you also had Kalaripatya, which is a Indian form of martial arts. And in fact, the practitioners of this martial art in India claim that they are actually the ones that the Chinese got Kung Fu from. Of course, the Kung Fu practitioners say Kalapariyatu is actually the source, or the Chinese say that the Indians got it from Kung Fu. Down the hall in the Mysore Palace was K.V. Iyer, the father of Indian bodybuilding. Here on his book Perfect Physique, was an active promoter of the sun salutation, and also a disciple of Eugene Sandow, the father of the modern male physique, and a key proponent in the emergence of what's referred to as muscular Christianity, which is in turn a key factor in the development of a number of different sports, including basketball, which was developed in part by one of the early leaders of the YMCA. So there's interesting threads coming from all of these different directions, coming out of the Indian Hatha Yoga traditions, and perhaps what had been hundreds or thousands of years old yoga practices coming together with all of these other threads. And Krishnamacharya wove them together masterfully and with virtuosity. And as a result, he drew an enormous amount of followers, in part through yoga demonstrations where he would perform these postures and attract new students and disciples. Well, it's not surprising then that his students and disciples, most notably his son Desikachar, BKS Iyengar, who just recently passed away, and this is one of my favorite photos. I always got to throw this in. The transnational reality of yoga here, the Eiffel Tower asana. And Patabi Joyce, whose system called Ashtanga Yoga is at the foundation of, I would say, 90% of any sort of movement-oriented yoga systems today. In fact, Joyce in particular systematized Krishnamacharya's system, and practitioners of Ashtanga actually still practice a form of yoga that was probably systemized for the larger part by Patabi Joyce with Krishnamacharya roughly in the 1940s and 1950s. Well, Patabi Joyce passed away a few years ago. Actually, Desikachar now is apparently in quite ill health, and so there's a real generational shift going on in yoga. And so his son, for example, Manju Joyce, with a not-to-be-named yogi over there, is one of the inheritors of this tradition, and also Sharat Rangaswamy. Well, what marks the Ashtanga lineage in particular is this profound virtuosity of the body. And practitioners here, like David Freeman, David Swenson, and Keno McGregor, who are key students who have brought yoga to Europe and America, embody the profound demands that this system of practice puts on the body. Well, to bring some sort of theoretical perspective to bear on all of this, in my book, which Courtney mentioned earlier, one of the things I argue is that in the history of yoga, primarily I was looking at the pre-modern history of yoga, yoga has been characterized in both philosophical and narrative literature as a means to both worldly power and release from suffering. The idea being that if you discipline the mind and the body, they become very powerful. But that power is ambivalent or ambiguous. It can be utilized to achieve power in this world, or it can be used to kind of separate yourself from it. And interestingly, just as often it seems, it was utilized for the sake of obtaining power. And the powers that came out of yoga were talked about in pretty grand terms. The ability to see near and far, or hear near and far. The ability to read others' minds, or enter into and take over their bodies, even. To become gigantic and extraordinarily large, or become very small. Very importantly, to fly through the air, to levitate, etc. And one of the things I argue in this book is that on one level we can talk about these in sort of classical terms as a sort of numinous power. The power of becoming like a deity. You know, who can see near and far? The gods. Who can hear near and far? The gods. Who can fly from place to place at will? The gods can. So yogis and yoginis are becoming like deities. But the other side of it is that it communicates, or one might argue, it communicates a narrative about authority. That somehow through these yoga practices, one could demonstrate some special capacity, you know, maybe an overwhelming power of charisma, or an uncanny ability to know what others are thinking. And that in itself is a basis for affirming that person's accomplishment. And what I argue in the book in part is that you see the powers emphasized in environments where there's less structural authority. And you see them kind of push to the periphery when there's more of an organizational element. And on a certain level, you would expect that. Well, within modern yoga traditions, what I'm going to argue here is that virtuosity comes to be expressed through the new medium of the body. That as yoga shifts towards a more athletic, a more calisthenic, a more physical form, you know, what I might refer to as a sort of philosophy of physicalism, the virtuosity in the body becomes the key marker of accomplishment. So the ability to get the legs behind the head, for example, becomes a marker of a person's accomplishment within the yoga body. Or one might even say to move the body in ways that a body normally doesn't move. To break the boundaries, to push or stretch the boundaries of embodiment altogether. Again, touching on this notion that this human is crossing over into some other realm. They're becoming something different. And that in itself has an internal existential dimension. And at the same time, it radiates out and calls for, you know, the experience of wonder and perhaps the acceptance of a person as embodying authority. There are many different possibilities, of course. But all of them sort of speak and grab our imagination or capture us in their expression of pushing or stretching the boundaries of what's possible. Now, that concept then lends in the development of yoga as sport. And so yoga as sport ties in, sort of brings that expression of transcendence in the physical body associated with yoga accomplishment to that transcendence of performance that one identifies with sport. And in fact, having practiced a bit of Ashtanga yoga myself, you know, there was one time I was sitting there and I'm sitting in a room full of basically Olympic athletes, you know, who have been pushing themselves for years. You know, Mysore practice, typically people are doing it for 2 to 3 hours every day, every morning, 6 days a week, you know, with the exception of when one of those days falls on a new moon or something like that. This is a discipline that people have poured their heart and soul into. Well, in recent years, in part due to the efforts of Rajashree Chowdhury, the spouse of Bikram Chowdhury, who's associated with Bikram Yoga. There's a Bikram Yoga Center in town, the so-called hot yoga, has helped form both a USA yoga organization and the International Yoga Sports Federation. Their goal being to develop yoga as an Olympic sport. And I find that, such an interesting kind of confluence, given that Olympic-like level of skill that I've seen actually exhibited by these practitioners, and what you see at these national and international yoga championships, which are expressions of bodily mastery that seem to push the limits of what is capable in the human body or human anatomy. Stretching the body, demonstrating strength and balance, reaching their limits. I should be saying, don't try this at home, right? Whoa. So the transcendence then of these boundaries and that evocation of wonder and awe communicates some sense that the limitations have been transcended. And go back to John's talk and that sort of moment where you realized that what you had thought was the limit is in fact not the limit, or something to that effect. And the way it transforms the viewer as well as the practitioner. And I can say again, going back to one of John's points, having practiced in the Ashtanga yoga system, there were times where I worked day after day after day, and feeling like I'm in the same place, and all of a sudden I break through, and I'm deep in some posture. And I think to myself, I finally got it. And then the next day I go to practice, and I'm not getting anywhere near it. It takes not only getting there, it's almost like a glimmer, you get a glimpse of it, and then you have to keep coming back again. You got to get back in that routine, and eventually it becomes routine. But it's not something that happens immediately and for all time, but it rather has to be mastered. And I think that mastery may tie into that the compelling quality of that performance. So thank you very much.